Hey everybody, I'm Francesca Maxime, and this is Wise Girl for August 24th, 2018. I can't believe we are already almost closing out summer for this year. I'm really thrilled to have a beautiful woman and spirit with us today, Ruth King, author of the recently published Mindful of Race, which there you can see it a little bit better. It's really a wonderful book and really invites us into this opportunity to explore our inner lives and kind of get curious about what's going on with us, and then also apply that same kind of curiosity to the world in which we interact with and that we relate to. Ruth King is an international teacher in the Insight meditation tradition, an emotional wisdom author and life coach. She is on the Teachers Council at Insight Meditation Community of Washington and Spirit Rock Meditation Center, and is the founder of Mindful Members Insight Meditation Community in Charlotte, North Carolina. Currently recognized as a trainer of trainers and a consultant to consultants, King offers teachings and that she teaches the Mindful of Race training and facilitation programs, which blend mindfulness principles and meditation with an exploration of our racial conditioning. That's really the heart of it, its impact and our potential. So there's a hopeful message here. Both dynamic and compassionate, she is indeed. King speaks to the heart of her audiences with authenticity and joy. Welcome, Ruth King.
Thank you. It's so great to be here. As you were reading that bio, I was saying, oh, I want to meet her. Thank you. This is great.
I love it. I love it. I want to meet her too. And I think everybody else wants to meet you because indeed, you know, there's something about embodied presence that I've often said, you just feel it from the inside out when you're in a room with someone who has a joyful capacity in their heart, regardless of what's going on, that can be tapped into, not negating some of the stuff that happens in the world that we may find challenging and is unjust, but that there's a joy in there that you certainly bring to the table and light up the room. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
So your book, Mindful of Race, is subtitled Transforming Racism from the Inside Out. And before we started recording, we talked about how this is hard work, but it's also heart work.
Exactly. In fact, commonly one of the ways I talk about this is that racism is a heart disease and it's curable. So I think I'm talking about the global heart in a way, and how we're really connected. And when we've had this chronic pattern of racial distress and injury and harm at the social level and also at the individual level, if we could just bring our mindfulness practice and drop this distress right into the heart of it, I think we're right in the zone of looking at how we can create a certain kind of composting of our distress into soil that serves our community.
Beautiful. I love that image of composting and sort of tilling the soil, because it's really that regeneration. We're always planting seeds, we're composting, we're tilling, we're planting, we're weeding, growing, enjoying the fruits.
That's right. That's right. That's the hope, right? And all of those ways, the doing part is that we are connecting in the doing, that there is a felt sense, a connection, that we're not removed from it. It's not conceptual. We can't be conceptual. We can't be in a conceptual frame in our garden touching the dirt. It's something we can feel and know and appreciate while we're doing it. So I think this kind of exploration of being mindful of race from the inside out puts us into a place of deep intimacy with our lives and our sense of belonging. And that's my prayer, if you will, in bringing mindfulness and our racial conditioning together in the soil.
Beautiful. And, we'll go through the parts of the book. You have part one, starting with understanding habits of harm and the diagnosis there. And we can talk about that. But mentioning this word conditioning, it's really sort of at the root of, the Buddhist teachings, which is, wrong view or delusion, ignorance, sort of not knowing what you don't know, that
Yeah.
blind spot, that myopia. And a lot of us live in worlds where perhaps we either don't see race at all, or we only see it, or, that there's a way to somehow recognize and start to decalcify, I like to say, not only our habits around our own personal and individual conditioning, but also look at the systemic sort of larger structures in which we also operate, and as you say, are a belonging part of.
That's right. And one of the ways I like to talk about that is through the Buddhist teachings of the Two Truth Doctrine, which is about ultimate reality and relative reality. And it really relates to race very beautifully here, because in ultimate reality, we're nobodies, right? But in relative reality, we're in these bodies, in these spacesuits, in these ethnicities, in these races, in these ages and models, and we're bumping into each other, and we're socialized to be in relationship with that complexity. So we're in these different camps, and there are what they are within relative reality. But then there's a value that's placed on the groupings of identities, and there's dominant groups and subordinated groups, and that dynamic is what makes relative reality what it is, all these different camps we're in. But we need these bodies, we need the relative reality, we need these experiences of being in relationship to each other to wake up to ultimate reality. We don't get to just bypass our lives under the umbrella of a beautiful spiritual life and not feel our lives. We actually need to feel our lives in order to recognize and get glimpses of ultimate reality, which is that place where we're beyond race. We are race, but we're beyond race. We're not fixated in it, or it's not necessarily an experience where it has to be dominant or subordinated. There's a sense of synergy in our relative reality. There's a lot to say about this, so I'm summarizing in a way, but there's this important piece of understanding our relational kinship in relative reality that supports our enlightenment or liberation, increasing moments of liberation where we can know a sense of the ultimate reality.
Well, that's so beautiful. And it also reminds me of the Bodhisattva vow, which is, to the liberation of all beings. None of us is free until we're all free, really, at the end of the day. And so my own personal liberation is part and parcel with collective liberation. And that's for all beings.
That's right. And that's not because every single individual has to be, on the same page at the same time. That those teachings are about us really understanding our interdependence, the idea of compassion as a weapon of mass healing, and instead of the alternative, which is a lot of harm, and that that non-harming has to be non-conditional. That we have to bring that into a front of our view, this value or this precept that we have of non-harming in our tradition especially. So that's how the Bodhisattva moves through the world with these vows, through a recognition of ourselves. I see you, I see myself in you. I understand this at a very deep level, this idea of interdependence, non-harming, and compassion. So that's something that I think helps us know that when we're walking in the world with that kind of intention, practicing with that as a value, it offers a certain radiance in our aliveness. And it's that radiance that I think is giving off the light of the Bodhisattva that then permeates our environment. And so it's not just a one-on-one thing, your life and my life, but it's really how we're walking in the world, the radiance we bring. And that's why I like to speak of the book and the work that I do as transforming racism from the inside out, because it can't be conceptual. It has to be a practice of deep care and belonging for not just our own well-being, but that of our social and global context.
Beautiful. And, you know, when you're speaking, it reminds me of sort of some of my own journey, or that of which, you know, I'm aware, and a few other people that I know a little bit about their journey. And sort of the first part of waking up seems to be, at least for me anyway, was like, wow, like in a way, there's nothing wrong with me, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like I'm
Mm-hmm.
heavily conditioned, and there's nothing wrong with me, kind of like the relative absolute, you know, the two truths doctrine that you were talking about. So of
Mm-hmm.
course I have programming. Everybody has programming, you know, big programming like societal, structural, religious, institutional, and then little programming like our family of origin or certain relationships that, you know, have mapped us out in a way. And then the mindfulness that we bring to our lives now can create that agency, that space, that awareness. We're bringing in that knowing quality into, we're aware of what it is that, you know, we've been programmed with, and
That's right.
updating the software, so to speak, just, you
That's
know,
right.
to
Mm-hmm.
have it be a little bit more inclusive. But to your point about being this light, I'm just going to play devil's advocate. Some folks might say, but I don't see race. I'm colorblind. And then Conda Mason had introduced me to the concept of cultural competency, and how that's very different from colorblindness. And I was wondering if this is an appropriate point in the conversation to kind of explain what you might mean by that, or how people might be able to begin to understand, even if their intention is to bring love or light or interdependence or connectivity
Mm-hmm.
into the conversation or into their embodiment, that if colorblindness and not cultural competency is present predominantly, that there may be a missing link.
Yeah, well, I think it's so important for us, because a lot of people that don't see color are white people. I mean, let's be clear about that. I very seldom see a person of color talking about being, you know, unable to see color, because that's our lived experience. But one of the ways I try to get at this very common question is that we are all good individuals. We all have come through some conditioning through our family system, our guardianship, from the place that we were raised and the people that surrounded us. We're all shaped by their beliefs and concepts and care. And this is, you know, we've all had traumas. We've all had ways we've figured out how to never be hurt again, you know, maneuver in that way. We all have our temperaments and personalities. This is all at the individual level. We're all good individuals. And we're also part of racial identity groups. Some of us are in multiple racial identity groups. And whether we like it or not, we are membered in those groups. Some of us know that, and some of us don't. So many people of color, for example, can readily identify with being a part of a racial identity group, because their survival depended on them knowing each other. And what most people of color have in common is being oppressed by dominant culture. So what happens is people of color can readily identify with being membered, and many white people don't identify with being a part of a white racial group. They see themselves as white individuals. And this is a big way that we miss each other. White people come to the table as good, well-meaning individuals. People come to the table as good, well-meaning individuals. And I'm a part of a racial identity group that's been kind of impacted by dominant white culture. But when white people come to the table and they can't claim the dominant white culture that they are a member of, then we tend to miss each other in the conversation, because white folks are talking about their individual experience. People of color are talking about the accumulative impact of race. And that, to me, is a really profoundly important way for us to understand how we miss each other and what gets triggered and where we get snagged in the conversation, you know? So that's one way that I try to understand it. Now, it would be different if our experiences, if we were just operating at the individual level, that wouldn't be an issue. We look at the individual level and we're talking about biases. We look at the group identity level, then we're starting to talk about discrimination and racism, because group identity then rolls into organizational leadership roles. But that's a different kind of conversation. So I think it's really important for us to understanding how we impact each other, is to understand that we're often looking at the situation of race and racism from the lens of our individual and our collective experience as a racial identity group.
Beautiful. And I think that that very concept of looking at things from the perspective of what your racial identity group is, as you said, sort of inherent if you are in a group that has been oppressed or marginalized, but may be missed and not even taken note of, or really a sense of awareness around that if you are white.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can go back to the comment earlier. I mean, I've had people often say to me, white people, when I look at you, I don't see color. And I know what that means. I mean, it's a ultimate reality statement. I see you, I don't see color, you're a good person. That's an individual comment. But my need as a person, as a Black woman in a racial identity group that is oppressed by white people, I don't want my identity to not be seen, because that then feels dangerous and like it's something missing. And oftentimes what's missing is an understanding of collective group experience. And the reason it's missing is because white people at large haven't looked at collective, which is a part of being in a dominant group. I don't care if it's a racial dominance or a gender dominance or religious dominance. Characteristic of dominance is that you don't have to look at yourself. And so this is the disconnect. When white people, this is the comment when people can say, all lives matter. All lives matter is an individual view. It's an ultimate reality view. Black Lives Matter is looking at the relative reality of the dynamic in our social realm, where there's dominance and subordination of different groups. And the call, if you will, for Black Lives Matter is a call for a social equanimity that is lacking in the world. That's what movements are made of, right? So it's really important to understand collective dominance when we're in these conversations, and your membership in those groups. Because if that's not seen, then there's a texture, and it's like having a white plate that's not really looking at the gravy that's on it or something. We need to get the gravy's on the plate and it's going to be messy, so let's get the biscuit and work this issue.
I love that. We're going back to food. I love
We're going back to food.
Everything goes back to food, the primordial nourishment, if you will, right? With our gut being our first brains, if you will. And really what you're bringing into the conversation is the heart mind, right? That originally this is not just mindfulness, is not just the mind, it's the heart mind. And some things do, in fact, get lost in translation. But I want to get back to this piece that you said about oppression and sort of subjugation, dominant group and marginalized group, because I feel as though for perhaps a lot of the folks who might be listening, there's a little bit of a potential trigger, or, Robin DiAngelo coined the phrase white fragility. And I know Reverend Angel Kira Williams has spoken of white racial fragility, and sort of clarifying that a little bit. And I guess back to this idea of, but I don't see race or color blindness. I'm just trying to play devil's advocate here, that there's this piece I think that comes in of, okay, so if you wake up to that and you kind of recognize, wow, I'm part of this dominant group, or this white identified or racially privileged group, even if my life isn't perfect and I have individual traumas and pains and other things that might be happening, like, that aren't pleasant for me, whether it's a child that's sick or, a marriage that is having challenges or whatever, that doesn't negate the fact that in this context of race, that there's still this larger container in which I'm a part, or membership of this group that I'm part, that has privilege and that is dominant. That then sometimes folks kind of feel perhaps overwhelmed, or step back, or don't want to engage in the conversation, or feel as though they don't know how to engage in the conversation because they themselves feel overwhelmed by perhaps the impact of what all of that might mean, based on the history of this country, how it was founded, and whatever else. Once these, stones begin to be unturned, all the little critters kind of move about.
That's right.
And so how might you invite using the mindfulness practice as the grounding practice, this, as you started the book, internal sense of looking within, transformation from the inside out, that is potentially a way to help solidify, or any other ways that people might be able to get fortified and courageous to continue to walk through this door toward this collective belonging, as opposed to use it as a aversive, stance.
Got it. Yeah, it's a great question. And I think a couple of things. One is, and this is especially for white people, I think, that are beginning to wake up to the terror of this. A lot of it due to our political climate right now in the United States. A lot of white people I'm talking to and working with through the training are starting to see, oh my gosh, I'm really getting that, that this is there's a racial dynamic here that could be looked at. And there's a sense of embarrassment that comes with that, shame, guilt, shutting down. And what's happening is people are starting to recognize that they are interested in having this conversation, and even a feeling like we got to have this conversation. A lot of passion is going on at this time for white people around really stepping in and owning it. And they're coming into a rushing river that has existed, and they're just now stepping into the water of. In other words, people of color have been in this conversation and in this racing train or river for a number of years, if not generations. And some white people are just starting to wake up that a river is even existing. So that adds to a level of overwhelm, I think, in trying to get your arms around who am I as a white person and what can I do? Can I swim? Should I exercise my privilege to just pass and not go there? But for those of us who are interested in having this conversation and staying in the river, joining the river of this discussion, I think the practice of mindfulness plays a pivotal role, because what it does is it supports us in being with the overwhelm, in developing an intimate relationship with our tendency, our impulse, our habits around relating to this, the ways we go to sleep, the ways we invest and then back out. Mindfulness, is a way that we can really look at those impulses and see if we can understand a deeper understanding of our fear or our overwhelm or anxiety that goes with it. But before we do that, we have to invest in or set an intention that we're going to take this ride and stay in the river. Because if you don't have that intention, it's so easy to just hop out and lay in the sun on the side. But it's important that you say, I'm jumping into this and I'm going to the other shore with all of the people engaged in this conversation towards liberation. I'm invested here. I'm not going to take the exit route. I'm not going to come out. So when you invest, then there's two structures that I think can support you. And one is the mindfulness structure of being able to lean in to the vagueness, the confusion, the overwhelm, the rage, the shame. You can really comfort and bring compassion and some of our heart practices to those edges. We can really use our practice to understand how we hide, where we close, what it's like to be open. And we can cultivate and kind of rest in those moments where we are noticing that we can survive this, that we can face it with ease, that it's impersonal on some levels, that it's impermanent on many levels. It's not going to kill us. We're going to learn something from it. This is our lives. It's not pretty all the time, but we can bear witness to it. So that's one structure that I think is so important, and being able to sit with what's really here as we take a walk, take each step, take a breath, and just be here with what's here now. And also know when we're adding levels of complexity to it, and how we hide out, and how we're trying to protect our heart, and how we don't want to be remembered. All those things we get to see up close and personally in our mindfulness practice. So that's one structure. And another structure is through the racial affinity groups, where we get ourselves with like race people and begin to intimately kind of decolonize or deconstruct through a series of questions how we've been conditioned around this, so that we can bring a bit of aeration to it. We want to look at what we've been taught to believe that maybe is no longer true, how we might carry with us an unconscious loyalty to our lineage, our racial lineage, without even knowing it. So there's some questions that we can ask and talk out loud to each other, so that we are carrying our own weight in this dynamic. One of the pains, I think, is that white people, when I say white people, I'm just using that to simplify the language, have not engaged themselves as a racial identity group. What many have done, though, is they've joined other races and causes, and that's essential work. I mean, activism is really essential work. And I'm not saying we not do that, but when white people haven't done the work of whiteness, people of color end up having to educate them on what they can learn about themselves. And so they're not carrying their literacy weight, and it's something that they can do. It's so much information out there on whiteness. There's no reason for people not to go there and learn from it. But the racial affinity group is a structure that supports like races to come together and investigate, how did we get here? And not so much what we do, but can we be with our conditioning and recognize our story in the larger story of our racial conditioning. So those two structures of a mindfulness practice and a racial affinity group, I think really supports us in kind of deconstructing our habitual response to this stimulus of race and racism.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I really appreciate that, because I think that for a lot of folks, you just mentioned, the work of whiteness. A lot of people don't know that there's work to be done out there in terms of the work of whiteness. And yes, there are a lot of resources out there. I've taken a lot of classes along these lines myself, whether it's the whiteawake.org classes that are offered out of the DC Insight, not out of there, but the group sprung out of the Insight Meditation Center of DC, or other classes like the one Patty Dye offers on racism, PATTIDIGH.org, or the work that you offer as well, not only in Sangha, in meditation centers, but also for corporations and organizations across the board, because of your work with structures, and not just looking at the mirror, the individual lens. I have to say, it was interesting, because I always figured that I was a bit of an ally, right? Because I'm multi-ethnic, and I'm sort of roughly 75% white European and 25% Haitian, African American, ancestry. And I read James Baldwin in school, and I, had this family that was, very much, committed to social justice and economic justice for all, and all of that. And yet I was, for much of my life, looking at things only through this piece of, not as a member of, as you say, this privileged community, or if I was privileged in certain ways, perhaps with education or whatnot, but I really wasn't interrogating my own whiteness. And so when I looked at these classes, I took them, I was like, wow, now I get it.
Yes.
I was like, now I understand. And, and it was great and also overwhelming. So my own personal experience was about a year ago when I started really, really diving into this work. It did kind of, I did feel like I stepped into the river a little bit, but, I found a branch and I hung on and doggy paddled and got a life vest and, whatever it is that one does in these situations. And then, like you say, kind of unconsciously, I guess I made a commitment to it, to invest and to keep on going and to say, okay, well, this is the work, and to weave it in. And not as a either or, but to say, this is part of my life now. This is like part of life, and it's part of what I'm intentionally setting the compass of my heart to include and to interrogate and to look at in my life. So just for, listeners who may be on this journey also of just sort of where do I begin, I just want to share my own personal anecdote, because it definitely was a waking up in that way for me.
Yes.
But really, I'm grateful that it's a path that I've, looked at more deeply, because I thought I knew a lot of things that I absolutely did not know anything about.
Yes, and it's not uncommon. I mean, how can we know? I mean, we're conditioned. I mean, that's not horrible. That's just a fact, and so what we do next is so important, because of the times we're living in are the result of seeds that were planted in the past. What we're going to be seeing is what seeds are planted now. They're going to bloom. So the consciousness, and especially the collective consciousness we bring to this chronic fatigue of race and racism that's in our society, this kind of crippling, coagulated, we need to bring an anticoagulant practice to the ways that the heart and mind is clogged around this issue. And I think the only way I know that helps that is the very ways you're talking about it, which is you invest in knowing. So that, it's like when you know better, you do better. You invest in the knowing. You set that intention and you stay in the inquiry. And it's going to be messy. I mean, it's not, it can't be any other way. And I think if we enter the conversation thinking, we shouldn't be touched by it, it's another form of delusion. So of course we're going to get our hearts broken. Of course we're going to be caught in a snag of ignorance and innocence. Of course I tell people they get 10 get out of jail free cards a day, because we're going to blow it. And on one side of the card, you write, oh, this is how I put my foot in my mouth. And on the other side of the card, this is what I learned from it. Because it's a practice. This is not a perfection. It's a practice. And like you started with, and I've said many times, it's hard work and it's heart work. Our heart is intimately involved in being in this conversation and our desire, our deep desire to be well. And when we touch into our need, that a part of our conditioning is protecting our heart. A lot of the ways we hide and take the exit routes is because it's so tender. We're really being touched and we're afraid. And to care for that fear allows us to float on our backs in the river a little bit for a while we just regroup and know that we're still here. We're still part of it. We're still in it.
No, it's beautiful. And it makes me think of, we're Homo sapiens, we're mammals, right? We're the ones who are aware that they're aware, the one who knows they know, the knowing itself, if you will, the absolute, sort of perspective, but also the one who knows they know. So this quality of this knowing, this knowingness, this verbing, I say, not the nouning, of our interrelatability across beingness, across culture, across race, across class, if you will, or socioeconomic, whatever quote unquote others or differences or whatever, that we can be distinct and unique and have the same innate Buddha nature, if you will, or,
Yeah, of course. And again, that's individual and collective. We're all, mammals, and we're all humans with this capacity to know and reflect on our lives. And, we're all distinct in the sense of the way we've been shaped by life. We have a certain shape to us that we're in, and a certain way that our view has been shaped. And these are things we can recognize, this kind of patterning or habituation in our distinctness. We can recognize the collective constellation of our membership, right?
Beautiful. Yeah. And it's making me think of, this mammal thing. We need, especially humans, we need other people to take care of us when we're little. We're not like turtles and such, we were, but we're not anymore,
Right.
And so one of the things that's come up, I think, in some of the work that I've done is recognizing, being with other people is a human drive, just like thirst and hunger. You die of loneliness, you don't die of, some people will beg to differ, but lack of sex. But it's true, you don't. But that this idea of separation versus this idea of belonging is really kind of fundamental to the well-being of anyone. And some folks, who was it, Mother Teresa, who said, don't make your family so small, I'm paraphrasing, cast your net more widely in terms of your heart, the who you hold in it in terms of your family. But we do have these sort of tribes that we kind of chunk down ourselves into, which oftentimes, especially the way our culture proscribes it, can be just our little nuclear family in our little suburban development with our own individual pool and our own car. And we forget that we came from this ancestry, this human ancestry, this lineage of being in community, of, tribes of 150 interrelated, codependent, in a good way, people who always were interacting and meeting one another. And so I feel like we're sort of talking about things that benefit folks who have white skin privilege, right? Or white identified folks, that they may not recognize the benefit. Because I've heard from a lot of folks like, well, why should I care? Well, things are pretty good. Well, I'm okay. I didn't do anything.
Right.
And yet there's this sort of existential angst that often emerges, that is this sort of nugget of separation that I think gnaws away at the heartstrings of a lot of folks. And that this might in fact be the antidote to that without, buying something that big pharma drug company, not that there's anything wrong with that. I'm saying, that isn't proscribed in that way.
Yeah, I think you're saying a lot in what you're saying. And I do think that a lot of our social conditioning is strongly around an individualist kind of lens. That is dominant culture driven mindset in this country. And I think that's a big part of our conditioning, being at the individual level and not recognizing membership and our relationship to something larger than our own comfort. So it's not a surprise. I mean, I think when you think about it, we're all wanting ourselves to be safe and to be happy. And this is a metta prayer, right? We want our family to not be in harm or endangered. And, so our circles can be small, Because it's such a part of our conditioning. We're not in the habit of thinking about the whole world all the time, but that's the invitation. And not so much the invitation, but when you're in this practice, you tap into that deeper knowing of your membership. And it can be very frightening to tap in and feel a very tiny piercing into something vast that you also recognize as yourself, if you so to speak. So I just think it has to do with, again, whether we are intending to take this on as a topic. And quite frankly, I've met enough people who are not interested in that intention. But if you are, and if you set that intention, you can always kind of come back to that and say, okay, so what's really important here? It's not like we stay in the river forever. Sometimes we have to get out and, dry out because our skin starts, what happens when you're in water too much. You have to get out and thaw out and then get back in again. But I think the intention is the intention of heart is what's so important here. And I think we have a growing critical mass in society right now that's interested in taking deep dives into this area, all races. People of color are also looking at how they dive into this, and stay in it and stay fresh in it and not as burdened. And again, what makes the difference is that we have these two structures of mindfulness and the racial affinity group that fortifies us and becomes places of refuge where we can rest and know and recommit and be recognized through the lives of others that we're with, of who we are and how we are on this journey, both as ultimate and relative beings.
Great. A couple more things I want to just address before we kind of start to wind down. A couple, one, I would like for you to sort of maybe walk us through a little bit of what a racial affinity group meeting might look like, because I know you talked about that in a sort of general way, but what does it really look like? And then also, if you could give us an example, perhaps, of what it means to use your privilege in a way that's effective. An example I have comes to mind, which is very simple, about a woman who was white, who was a sister-in-law of a woman who was Black. I don't even know if this was from Joy DeGruy book, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, or not, but they were in line at a checkout store or something, and the white woman went through and then with her grocery items, and then the woman who was Black was asked to provide ID and double check when she went to write her check, and the woman who was white said, why, you don't need to do that, you just did that with me. You didn't do that with me, so why are you doing that now? And so she was using her privilege to check with the woman who was doing the grocery store, checking, and that was just like a point, right? A very small point, a very localized point, but it was one thing that kind of stuck out as a nugget in my mind. So those two things, an example of a racial affinity group, or perhaps a way that somebody might, that white, using your privilege to good might show up on a regular basis. But two other things I want to talk about. One is, you talk about anger with people of color, right? People, I know when I had once said to someone, gee, it would be nice, who is a white Dharma teacher at a retreat, oh, it'd be nice if there were more POC in the room. And the first response I got without hesitation was, you're angry. And I was like, whoa, okay, not really, but that's okay. And then the second point is joy. You kind of go to the end of the book, you start talking about the importance of cultivating joy and the importance of, recognizing what's good and the beauty that's there, and not just being mired in reality, which can be painful.
Yeah. So let me just try to address these 4 points you just raised, which I think there's some overlap to them that we can talk about. And maybe a good place to start is looking at examples of the use of privilege. But before I say that, let me say this, that in my book, I'm talking about three ways to look at race and racial conditioning. One is through the individual lens, which we talked about a bit. One is looking at the coming through the lens of our racial group identity. And this is understanding ourselves as members in racial group identity, and that there's a collective experience there that we share and that is also projected on us. And then the third is the institutional level, which whatever the dominant racial group is in the institution, what they carry with them is their racial conditioning. And because the racial group identity of whiteness hasn't been investigated, then the unconsciousness of whiteness is carried into the institution and then proliferated. So when we look at a good use of privilege, we have to look at from which of those three lenses we're looking through. Because if we're always working at all three of those levels all the time, we're going to get burned out pretty quick. So I think we can decide where we put our energy. So the example you gave of the check stand going through, for example, that's an intervention at the individual level. That's an individual white woman calling a racial dynamic, real time, right on the spot. Here it is, you know, and very gentle. You know, why are you doing that? You didn't do that with me. That's an individual intervention. So we can choose. And there are multiple examples of intervening at the individual level because stuff is coming up all the time. So, and then there's interventions and the use of privilege at the racial group identity. This is where we get into our racial affinity groups and talk about where we might want to intervene. This could be also me speaking of the general voice of people of color, you know, or what I'm seeing is a dynamic of constellation here. It's a difference between all lives matter and Black lives matter is kind of understanding racial group identity and intervening there at the group level. And then there's the institutional level where you are really a part of causes and you're confronting policies, structures, norms of inequity and injustice, and you're membered in those efforts to bring about a change. So when we want to look at how we use our privilege, for example, we could look at if I'm in a leadership role, and I often am in a seat of a Dharma teacher, or I'm in the seat of author, or I'm, you know, a keynote speaker, or I'm a grandmother, you know, all these things have me in a seat of privilege. I can be mindful of how I use that role to make a difference for the collective. One example I like to talk about is my mother, who was very active in the Urban League, you know, had white skin, you know, privilege, not white skin privilege, but light skin privilege. She was a light skinned African-American woman in South Central Los Angeles, where we grew up. And she got all this access because she was light skinned. But what she did, which was an Urban League strategy, was to get into these institutions and then start to make a difference there by pointing things out, by inviting a different view, by, you know, whatever she did. And it opened all kind of doors or planted all kind of seeds. And that was a use of her individual privilege at the institutional level because she was intervening, but it was intentional. So I think we have to be intentional about which lens we want to respond to so that we are really focusing our energy and not overwhelming ourselves, and to be real clear what seat we're in when we're doing it. Like she was clearly in the seat of a Black woman making this intervention and recognizing her privilege. So we could do that. You know, there are times at the individual level where I tell people you have to think about whether you bid or pass, because you can't bid all the time on all of the issues. So I'm suggesting when we're looking at our use of privilege, and we all have some form of privilege, because it's a privilege just to speak your voice, depending on what the situation is that you're in. But to be clear and intentional about whether you're bidding or passing and which seat you're sitting in. Being in a racial affinity group is about, let me say a little bit about the structure of that, because I think it would help. And there's a link on my website on racial affinity group guidelines. But it really is simple, but not so easy being in these groups, because, you know, all of our stuff comes up. So the idea is to have a safe place to engage the complexity and all the tentacles of this discussion. So you make a commitment for 1 year. You meet once a month for about 2.5 hours. It's no more than 5 people and can be as small as 2, maybe 3 is, you know, could be great. You're inviting people who want to commit to this investigation over a period of time, and you're inviting people that are as close to your racial composition as you can get. So for you, it might be with a biracial group, right? For me, it might be with an African American elder group or something, you know. I think everybody should be in a racial affinity group, regardless of their race, because it's a place to build a new agreement in our relative reality around this topic, and to decolonize our minds. So you meet once a month for 3 hours. There's a period of sitting in it where you get still. So there's a guided meditation that I recommend. And then there's about 35 questions that I offer that people can investigate one at a time or take 2 at a time. And people go around and just share their response to the questions. These questions are directed at our internal conditioning around race, because we're looking at how we uproot our habituation, our habits of mind. And so that there's some sharing. I'm not suggesting that we're doing a lot of cross-talking initially, but just deep listening and seeing how we're impacted by it. The presumption is that people are practicing in a mindfulness practice, so that there's some continuity of stillness and being able to support what's arising and coming up for us. And that there's a checkout period at the end where we talk about what it was like. And so a lot of good instruction, instruction on guidelines for how you engage with each other so that it's safe, that we park our judgment, that we are more curious and critical, that we bring our heart to it, and that we stay. That so much is really based around people committing for that period of time, because if they don't, there's an exit route, and it really starts to deteriorate what the power of the group collective. So that's the racial affinity group structure, and there's a lot more to say about it on that.
Beautiful. Yeah, that's on the website. I love that. And then what about the piece about, sort of people of color being accused of being angry when they try and sort of say a few things that other folks may not want to hear or aren't ready to hear or feel, I don't know, somehow offended by?
Yes. So I think we can expect that to happen as people of color because we don't get to control people's way of responding to us. It's not in our control. So when we find ourselves triggered by that, to me, it just suggests, there's some ways I might need to know how to self-care in moments like that, because we can't control the ignorance that's in the world. So I think one way I manage that is that I actually am expect the ignorance to be there. I'm not walking as if, because if I find myself constantly triggered, then underneath that is a belief that it shouldn't have been there, or there's something working around the belief, and that belief can sometimes be, I know racism exists, but I don't expect it to happen to me. I don't expect it to come my way, but it is. It just most definitely is. So when we're shocked by it or surprised by it or thrown off our rock around it, I don't suggest that we expect the person we're interacting with to take care of it in that moment. So, our liberation can't be based on whether white people get this or not. It has to be based on something a lot deeper that we have a bit more control over. And that, to me, is what we're doing with our own practice and understanding that, ignorance is in the world. I'm walking in this world. I'm not hiding out. This is not, I'm not going to believe that I'm angry. I'm going to sit here in my seat. And if that's how they see it, then that's how it is. Another piece of it has to do with where we intervene. Again, more and more as an elder, maybe it's because I'm an elder or I don't know what it is, but I feel like I'm less interested in exerting my energy in places where it's not going to have impact. Or I want to make sure when I give all of that up, I've got the right audience that can do something with it. It's not just an ejaculation of energy and anger. I'm much more wanting more tantrically to use my energy to compost the experience I'm having, and then choose if this is a place where that gets to be shared. So it's about whether we're acting from a place of reactivity, because in those moments when we get slammed with, oh, angry Black woman or whatever, I've certainly got that a lot. I'm hurt in those moments, but I'm not as hurt as I used to be because I understand what that's about. And I'm not hurt because who I am is not invested on how I'm looking. So, or how I'm being perceived. So perception is something I talk a lot about in the book, misperception and how this gets tied around racial injustice. But at the individual level, we can't control the craziness that comes at us. But we can decide how we're going to roll with that. And sometimes we call it out and we have to leave it there for them to deal with without hoping there's going to be a certain response, because it's often an inadequate response. And that's a part of it,
Well, that whole thing of not attaching to outcome, but yet still staying curious and open-hearted, but then having the circle of compassion include yourself, and then, the self-care that goes along with that. And, in AA or 12-step programs, they say, take what you want, leave the rest, meaning, you bid or pass. Sometimes you pass,
That's right. And I also think when we have a place to come back to, like the racial affinity groups, where we can compost that, where we can really work with that in a wise way, in a mindful way, with supporting people who are also walking the path. It makes all the difference. It makes all the difference when we're in these racial affinity groups and our energy is not externalized, but we're really dealing with the core hurt and pain and how we deal with that in those circles, so that we can then be with what's happening in the world in wiser and wiser ways.
Yeah, beautiful. And then just to kind of wrap up, just two last points, the point about joy and about, sort of when some of this, there's just always going to be changes, right? Nothing is permanent, and the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Is that Dr. King's quote? So we're hoping that we're in this spiral where we're spiraling out toward greater well-being for all, and joy is a big part of that, because I think, like you say, if you stay in the river, you get kind of pruny, and you want to, jump out sometimes and dry out a little bit. And joy seems to be a way to kind of do that. Can you talk a moment about ways in which folks who may feel as though they need to abandon joy in order to do the work of being on the front lines of this, how maybe that can help actually sustain folks?
Yeah, it's a really good, it's an important lubricant. It's like an anticoagulant in this kind of healing process. And a piece, one of the ways that I like to talk about joy is that when we're in this, it reminds me of a story when I was with Angeles Arian, when I was writing my first book. And I was very anxious. This book was about rage, and I was on fire when I was writing it. and I was in the mindfulness practice, and she was this wise woman that I really had a lot of respect for. I went and had tea with her, and I said, this is just really hard writing this and blah, blah, blah. And she says, well, when's the last time you were in your garden? Or when's the last time you danced? And she just had a few things she was asking me, and it was like, oh my gosh, I haven't been doing anything but working hard. And she said to me, she said, you gotta bring a sense of delight into the complexity of these big things that you're going to be taking on. And when I thought about that, I thought about my mother growing up again in South Central Los Angeles. And, we were raised in the church, and my mother played the piano in the church. We all sang in the choir. But we also had on Friday nights, once a month, jazz improvisational jam sessions at our house. And one of the chapters in the book that I talk about is artistry as cultural medicine, as a way to be joyfully offering up our expression and serving it, just serving it to the community through our unique expression. So one of the pieces of joy and how we bring it to our necessary work of healing and activism around race and racism is that we really entertain what is our artistic expression that tickles us, that brings a certain lightness. I like to dance, and music is so important to me. I use it in my work. There's dancing and music in my mindful of race training. And I think that it just gives us a certain freedom that's immediate. And the expression that we are offering up from it is something we probably can't recreate because it's only in the moment. And I think we need to just entertain what that is for us, what brings us a sense of delight that really softens our heart and makes us smile. Maybe it's, sometimes when I look at my grandchildren, I got a great grandbaby coming in November. Just the thought of that brings certain joy into my heart. We need to bring that into the mix for, again, an anticoagulant to our healing around this.
Beautiful. Yeah. I mean, it balances out the other, practices and it's really a practice of equanimity in a way.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Appreciative joy, mudita, sympathetic joy, in addition to that, and shared joy with others, and really giving us an opportunity to celebrate one another's successes and not always be so competitive, perhaps, even with other people who are on the front lines. Also doing good work that, maybe we have little seeds of, envy. So.
There's definitely that. And there is, and we know there is. And, in time, I think that softens a little bit, especially through our mindfulness practice, because we have a place to kind of investigate those waves of envy and, resentment that comes up. And this happens, this comes up in our racial affinity groups where we get a chance to really see, the grind of that and how uncomfortable that is to experience on the inside. It looks like it's out there, but it really is an experience we're having in here. And I think over time that softens. But again, we all of this is about a practice. Our life as ceremony. We're in ceremony. All of what we're doing is ceremony and practice. And what gets better and better is the intention we put in it, the heart we bring to it, and again, our understanding of our interdependence, that non-harming is a non-negotiable, and that compassion is so necessary for us to move breath by breath, step by step.
Beautiful, Ruth. The book is Mindful of Race, Transforming Racism from the Inside Out. The website is ruthking.net. I'll post it as well. And I just want to really express my deep gratitude and bows to all the work that you've done and continue to do, and just the light that you are in the world, and really the heart of love and compassion that you share with us. And just so grateful that you were able to join us on Wise Girl today, Ruth. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It takes one to know one.
Wow, that's better than an Oscar.
Oh, that's good. That's right. Thank you so much. This has been so joyful. I appreciate it.
I am delighted.
Okay, great.
Your word. Take good care.
Okay. Be well.